After Final Fantasy Legend came out and became the first Final Fantasy game to sell 1 million copies, the same team would start working on a sequel. So in 1990, Squaresoft would release Final Fantasy Legend 2. According to Wikipedia, Kenji Ito was also brought in to work on the composition with Nobuo Uematsu. Now, instead of doing the same old typical review, I'm going to do more of a going from game to game comparison and only mentioning the differences between Legend 1, 2, and 3. It's going to be a shorter review, but it's going to keep me from looking around for scraps or anything to nitpick at. The plot of the game is decently written for a Game Boy game, but it's nothing to write home about. According to Wikipedia, the story of Final Fantasy Legend 2 revolves around Magi, or the 77 shards of shattered statue of the goddess known as Isis. And no, Isis, not the terrorist group. As a child, the main protagonist character is awakened by his or her father in the middle of the night, who explains he has to leave for a while. After leaving the protagonist with a Magi and instructing the protagonist never to lose it, he makes his way through the protagonist's open window. Years later, having grown up, the protagonist decides to set out to find his or her father, learning he was part of a secret group called the Guardians hunting from the Magi, fragments of an ancient statue that gives power to their bearers. Accompanied by 3 friends, the protagonist sets out. So what it amounts to is pretty much what Inuyasha's Magic Jewel was, except the main character is going after his dad instead of a big love triangle. Yeah, I know it's a game released in 1990, but it's cliche looking back at it. Going from Final Fantasy Legend 1 to 2, graphics haven't changed all that much. The game in certain areas has multiple layers of detail out in the open world. Outside of that, it hasn't really improved at all. It's still a pretty basic looking game. Even for a 1990 game, it lacks in comparison to other games in the genre. On the other hand, it still has elements of a high quality game. The monsters still look great, but because of how many enemies the game says there are of each type in a fight, it would be nice to see all of them on screen. On the other hand, it would look nasty trying to cram all of them on the Game Boy's tiny screen, so it's kind of a mixed bag. The audio is yet another solid outing to fight Nobuo Uematsu. I'm not sure how big of a role Kenji Ito played in the composition, but in the end, they did a pretty good job. The problem I have with the music is that it lacks an X factor where you go, oh my god, this is awesome. It's still a solid soundtrack overall, it's just that when you have created so many great soundtracks, it's hard to stand out. 90% of the time, I would take Nobuo Uematsu on its worst day than some composers at their best. The gameplay is improved, but it's in essence the same game. The game keeps the same number of characters, method of leveling up, and so on. It's more refined, and in general, I feel like it's less player hostile. Where they made it different is what weapons do. Weapons deal damage based on typing rather than based on your physical or magical offensive stats. Some weapons are agility based, strength based, and so on. This is a nice little change from your standard buy the biggest weapon and kill everything kind of mentality in other RPGs at the time. My problem is that in general it feels like the same game as Legend. There is really nothing that makes it stand out from the other game. When I played it, I thought I was playing the same game as Legend until I heard the music and realized this was a slightly different game. Better game than Final Fantasy Legend looking back at it, but it's not going to set the world on fire. Overall, Final Fantasy Legend 2 is an okay game. It refined the gameplay of the original, but time beat it like a redheaded stepchild. It's worth playing if you are a Final Fantasy fan, but there are better and more memorable RPGs on the Game Boy. I give it a 6 out of 10.